Hi, Al. Uh, my name's Joe. I'm just here on behalf of an organization called Leadnow, and I'm here to let you know that we've formally made our candidate endorsement for Daniel Blakey for the NDP. The NDP. They've got the best shot at defeating the Conservative candidate here in Elmwood Transcona. So I'm wondering if we can count on your support.
I have to think about it because I'm really not towards NDP. I was hoping you guys would say Liberal. I'm a Conservative, but I know it's time for a change, and I'm kind of thinking of Liberal.
But here in Elmwood, the Liberals are far enough back that they won't win, but you could end up opening the door for the Conservatives to win. So if we can get so in some respects, voting for the NDP here, getting Daniel Blakey elected, may actually help the Liberals form a government by taking a seat off of the Conservatives. So that's one thing. I don't know if that's something that helps you. Thank you very much for your time, Al.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, there you go. A message being repeated on doorsteps across the country. You heard Joe Wasylycia-Leis speaking with a voter in the Winnipeg riding of Elmwood Transcona. He's there with an organization called Leadnow. You may have even had them visit your doorstep already, especially if you too live in a hotly contested riding. Or you may have heard from another of similar campaigns to get Canadians to vote strategically, casting your ballot not necessarily for the party you love, but for the one with the best chance of preventing another Conservative government. Of course, strategic voting is not a new phenomenon, but with this election coming right down to the wire, we're asking today whether strategic voting is truly healthy for democracy. So let's start by returning to Leadnow to understand how its strategic voting project works. Amara Possian is the election campaign manager for the group, and she joins me in our Toronto studio. Hi.
Hi.
So we heard your organization going door to door. What are your volunteers telling you? How much strategic voting is really on the minds of Canadian voters right now at the door?
Well, at the door, we're hearing that there's a huge appetite for change on October 19th. People are frustrated by our broken democracy where the Conservatives can get 39% of the vote but get 100% of the power and are looking for a way to be effective with their vote. So we have people going door to door and having face-to-face conversations with voters across the country, and they're excited to hear about the recommendations that our community has made. And sometimes it takes a little bit of persuasion, but our volunteers are incredible. We've been having really exciting conversations, and I think we might actually have an impact on Election Day.
Leadnow is not the first to have a strategic voting campaign. Others, there was one in the effort to oust the Ontario Premier Mike Harris back in 1999. It did not work. Why do you think your project will succeed where others have not?
Historically, efforts like this have involved putting recommendations on a website or broadcasting recommendations at the last minute. And what sets Vote Together apart, I think, is that we are having thousands of face-to-face conversations with voters who want change. Just in the last couple of days, we've gone canvassing in 11 ridings and had phone banks in 11 ridings, and our distributed phoning network has made contact with 1,300 people across the country. So not only do we have recommendations and good local information at Leadnow.ca, but we're backing that up with solid ground game.
Now, you are actually polling in ridings that are close, like specific polling in those ridings, which really that hasn't been done by strategic voters before.
That's right.
How many ridings?
In 37 ridings. We crowdfunded over $100,000 from 3,000 supporters, and we ran polls in 37 key swing ridings, which is an issue with our our democracy right now. People have local polls, parties have local polls, but they aren't released. So often on election day, people look at national polls and regional projections in order to make assumptions about what's happening in their riding, and that doesn't reflect what's happening on the ground. So we've posted those polls at Leadnow.ca so people can see historic results as well as what's happening right now.
Okay, so 37 ridings, but you are actually concentrating on 11?
Yep.
Why is that?
Sorry. We've run polls in 37 ridings and made recommendations. We'll make recommendations in 30 by the end of the week. And that's because we wanted to make recommendations in places where the campaign was strong. So in every riding where we recommend a candidate, we have at least 500 people who've pledged to vote together, and then we engage them in a community process where we say, local polling and historic results show that this candidate can defeat the Conservative. Do you want to back them? And if the majority say yes, then we back that candidate. Now, in the 11 ridings, in addition to making that recommendation and sending out an email and letting people know, we're actually running a ground game. So we have teams that have been canvassing for months and building a block of voters who are committed to voting together for the best candidate who can defeat the Conservative. And now that we've made the recommendation, they're contacting those supporters again and saying, like you heard Joe say, we've made our recommendation. Will you vote for this candidate? And we're using all sorts of tactics: canvassing, flyering, texts, phone calls.
Why do you think strategic voting is good for the democratic process?
Well, I think our democracy is broken. Our first past the post electoral system means that our preferences as voters are distorted into false majorities. So again, in the last election, the Conservatives only got 39% of the vote, and they've been able to do whatever they want for the last 4 years. There's no check on their power. So I actually think that voting together is a way to assert our preferences as voters, and unfortunately, it's a practical and smart and necessary strategy, and I hope we never have to do it again.
Okay, well, let's bring someone else into this conversation. Michael Byers is a professor of political science at the University of BC. He is in Salt Spring Island. Hi, Michael Byers.
Good morning.
Well, what do you think of what Amara is saying about her case for strategic voting and broken democracy?
Well, I'm a big fan of youth engagement in politics, and Leadnow is a phenomenal institution. So congratulations to everyone involved. I do think that they're trying to be more accurate, more scientific about strategic voting in this election than anyone in Canada has been before. But I still think there are some serious problems that need to be considered. One of them is that it turns what should be an inherently positive experience into a negative one. Instead of voting for the party and the candidate who you want, who you are inspired by, who reflects your values, you're trying to stop someone who you don't like. And you're trying to cancel out other people's votes. And I know there's a case to be made for the necessity of that when you have a party or a prime minister who are acting against fundamental democratic principles. But it's a regretful exercise, and therefore I'm very concerned by it.
Well, what do you think is lost, Michael, when it is a negative driver as opposed to a positive one?
Well, one of the things that is lost is the local representation aspect of our parliamentary system. So people are looking at these polls. They're thinking about the national race. In the case of Leadnow, they're thinking about how to get rid of Stephen Harper, and the qualities of the individual local candidates are lost in this. I wouldn't want anyone to vote strategically until they had met all of their local candidates, had engaged them in conversation, had actually talked about policy, had factored in those other considerations, and weren't just looking at this national goal of trying to change a government. We're a big country. There's a lot of complexity. There are hundreds of excellent candidates who, because of strategic voting, will be essentially overlooked.
Well, Michael, you've written about how you've basically lived this on Salt Spring Island.
Well, yes, I have lived it in that my community has voted strategically, or large parts of it, in the last two elections. First for a Liberal, Bryony Penn, and then for Elizabeth May, who moved all the way from Nova Scotia to Salt Spring Island and Saanich Gulf Islands to try to win a seat for the Green Party, and was, of course, successful. I think, and I'm going to sound like I'm waffling here, but I'm not. I think there are certain instances where a community collectively decides that it needs to move on, that it needs to change its local representation for some greater good. But the strategic voting that took place in Saanich Gulf Islands wasn't driven by Leadnow. It wasn't driven by an outside organization. It was driven from the grassroots, from here, by people talking to each other and making that decision first in 2008 when they tried to elect Bryony Penn, and then again in 2011 when they were successful. But those are the exceptions. In most instances, communities don't actually know. There isn't very good information, and of course that information always changes. So Leadnow is doing polling, but we don't know how public opinion might shift between now and next Monday. If you'd been doing this kind of polling in 2011, most of it would have missed the orange wave. Most of it would have actually recommended voting for Liberal candidates when, in fact, on election day, New Democrats were better positioned to beat Conservatives.
Amara is shaking her head there. Go ahead. What do you want to say?
Oh, just that we've done multiple polls in the ridings where we're recommending, and we're looking at trends over time. And I think one of the things that we hear is that strategic voting is a blanket recommendation for one party based on national polls, and that's actually the exact situation that we're trying to avoid. I think in 2011, if we had looked at national polls, likely would have missed the orange wave, but that if riding level polling had happened in the ridings where the NDP surged, that we would have seen it.
I'd like to play a clip from someone who has orchestrated strategic voting campaigns in the past. In 2008 and again in 2011, Chris Micah worked on Project Democracy, a mass strategic voting effort. Listen to how it worked for them.
We were able to make a difference in about 5 ridings or so that went to opposition party candidates that otherwise would have won by Conservatives. So that was a small impact, not as great an impact as we had hoped for. And fundamentally, in our analysis, we realized that we would have to probably double or increase the participation from around 405,000 to about 1 million Canadians in order to have a really sizable impact on the election.
Amara Possian, he's talking about the need for like 1 million Canadians to get involved in this. Your numbers aren't that big. What would you consider to be successful campaigning then?
Well, I think it's important to remember that in 2011, the difference between a minority and a majority government was 6,000 votes across 14 ridings. So finding the right people in the right places is actually the important thing. Which is
exactly what the parties do, right? They look for those little changes. Keep going.
Yeah. Well, and we have about 90,000 people who've signed up to the campaign, and in our target ridings where we're running get out the vote efforts, having those face-to-face conversations that we're talking about being so important, in those ridings, we've done the math based on the margin of victory, and we have a fairly large block of voters that if even some of them voted together would be able to have an impact on election day.
Michael Byers, what do you think?
Well, think about the impact that all this talk about strategic voting is having in all the ridings that aren't being targeted by Leadnow. So, for instance, we have a lot of ridings here in rural BC that are races between Conservatives and New Democrats. But this talk of strategic voting and the recent rise in the national polls of the Liberal Party has a lot of progressively minded people in those rural ridings now thinking of voting strategically for the Liberals. That's the message they're getting because they hear this talk of strategic voting, they see the national polls, and they may actually be voting contrary to their interests because those still remain Conservative New Democratic races. So this is not to say that Leadnow is doing a bad thing in certain ridings, but there are larger system-wide implications of this. And I guess my message to all listeners is if you're going to vote strategically, be extraordinarily careful because there's a very substantial chance that you might get it wrong.
Well, and, talking about the impact, some of the impacts are already evident in the BC riding of Burnaby North Seymour. Some high-profile anti-pipeline activists have already publicly declared they will vote NDP instead of Green. And the Green Party candidate, Lynn Quamby, is not too thrilled about having strategic voting and that effect on her campaign. Listen to her.
It's a little surprising that they would endorse a candidate from a party that's on the fence about the pipeline when there's another candidate who is really strongly opposed.
Amara Possian, are you worried that your efforts could result in individual candidates getting sideswiped? Michael has raised this too about the who we're actually sending to Parliament.
I think it's regrettable that there are excellent candidates out there who should be in Parliament but can't be in Parliament because of our first-past-the-post voting system. Unfortunately, most of these candidates don't stand a chance because of vote splitting between opposition parties. There are many candidates out there who under a different electoral system would be able to represent us in Parliament, and that's ultimately what we want. So we're looking at this as a one-time thing. There's an unprecedented window for electoral reform right now. All of the opposition parties in some way have committed to implementing a new system by 2019. So we're seeing voting together on October 19th to defeat the Conservatives as a means to an end that is a more progressive country. So no matter what happens on October 19th, if the window is still there, which I think it will be, we're going to organize to push the parties to work together for electoral reform.
Michael, you once ran for the NDP. Was it 2008?
Yes, and full disclosure, I was hit badly by strategic voting in the last week of the campaign and lost to a Liberal incumbent. People making the decision that it was better to stick with an elected opposition member rather than switch their preferences and perhaps end up adding another seat to Stephen Harper's caucus. I can understand that, but it's an extraordinarily frustrating experience. Not only because you're putting all the work in, but because there was a very strong sense within our campaign that we were even leading the Liberal incumbent in that riding until the national message of strategic voting kicked in. So yes, I do feel some personal grievance about this, but there's something much more important that I worry about. There's a very real prospect that in the next few days we could see a further collapse of the Conservative vote in this country, and because of strategic voting, not only see a change of government, but actually elect another majority government. And majority governments do not engage in electoral reform. If you want electoral reform in this country, you want a minority government where there are two of the current opposition parties both committed to proportional representation, and that dynamic is what would then lead to change. If there's a Liberal majority government after October 19th, I would be extraordinarily surprised. In 1997, Tony Blair was elected in the United Kingdom on a promise of introducing proportional representation. It never happened. Mr. Blair realized that he could win a majority governments 3 in a row under the current first past the post system.
That's always the problem in Amara, because that's really your goal here, right? You say you want this to be the last time anyone strategically votes because you want to change the system. Mm-hmm. What do you think of what Michael just said?
Yeah, I agree. I think
you might be entrenching the system.
I don't think that's true. I think in the ridings where we're making recommendations, there's a clear candidate who could defeat the Conservative if we consolidated the vote around them. We're trying to be very responsible about this. Michael was previously talking about making sure that there are face-to-face conversations happening and people are engaging with their candidates. And in places where we have field teams, we've been meeting with all of the candidates. And it isn't a decision that we take lightly. And Leadnow can't do anything that our community doesn't want to do. So this is very much driven by them, and they're being responsible about it and having conversations. I don't know what's going to happen on October 19th. None of us do, but I do know that we're preparing for various electoral outcomes. And ultimately, I don't think the success of the Vote Together campaign is going to come down to what happens on the 19th. I think what we've done is build an independent political force outside the party system that is able to organize and campaign and hold governments accountable. And we're ready to do that. I don't think anybody is ready to just stop fighting on October 19th.
I want to pick up on that and ask a little bit more about the youth vote. Shachi Curl of Angus Reid says young voters are more likely to vote strategically. What do you make of that, Michael?
Well, I think that anything that brings young voters to actually go to the polls is a wonderful thing, and strategic voting does imply a certain degree of motivation. You want to actually see a change at the national level. And in my set, certainly talking to my students, I spoke to 100 of my undergraduate students about this yesterday, is that they are more motivated in this campaign than the students I spoke to in 2011 or 2008. It is driven to a significant degree by frustration, a sense that this government has been in power too long and that it's time for a change as they become less respectful of our democratic rights. But at the same time, in conversation with them, they also want to be inspired. They want to think about issues, and in the riding in which many of them will vote, a fairly young person who until recently was a student at UBC is one of the candidates, may not actually show very well in strategic voting calculations, but is attracting large numbers of young people to his campaign because he's young, because he's dynamic, because he has vision. And would you want to turn a candidate candidate like that off of politics, if people came behind him, he might actually be a future leader of a party or a country.
Amara.
Yeah, I think part of the reason that young people are not. Actually, never mind. I think I'm young. We're very engaged and we're smart, and we understand that the electoral system distorts outcomes and often choose different avenues for change.
I guess, could I just add one last thing
Sure,
here?
yeah.
I love what Leadnow is doing. I mean, I think you're a fantastic organization. And I think if you stay focused on just a couple of dozen ridings and you do really serious polling and you don't try to spin this into a nationwide exercise in strategic voting, that's okay. My concern is about the more than 300 ridings where you are not operating, where people are encouraged to think strategic voting because of conversations like this, have imperfect information, and actually end up voting against their interests because they get it wrong. So the message again to all the listeners who are not in these Leadnow ridings is to be extraordinarily careful about what you're doing. Look at your local candidates. Look at local indications as to how your neighbors are thinking. Actually talk to them. Don't throw away your vote by trying to get on a national bandwagon that may not be representative of what's happening at home.
This is a fascinating discussion, given the one we just had in the last half hour with people who are switching their votes because of the actual issues they're following, and they walk away from a party they've been with for a while. It's good to talk to you both. Thank you for being part of this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That is Amara Possian. She's the election campaign manager for the political advocacy organization Leadnow. She's in Toronto. Michael Byers is a professor of political science at UBC. We reached him on Salt Spring Island in BC.